In this video, we'll cover the steps to making a little bit of a more detailed axonometric floor plan drawing, which you can see on the right here. So this is kind of what we're going for, versus on the left side, which is kind of the quicker and easier version, which is a rasterized image, which means it's essentially just a screenshot from our 3D modeling software that's pixelated. While as this one on the right is a vector drawing, which means we're essentially taking the line work from our 3D program, exporting the lines to Illustrator, and actually editing them to give us a little bit more control over the final quality of the drawing. So we'll start with our 3D SketchUp model. I've already got the section cut to where I want it to be. Something to note is that I cut out all my windows because I'll be adding those in Illustrator. So now that I have the scene and section set up, I'll go ahead and change the style. And we'll be doing the hidden line style, which is in the default styles. And I'll go ahead and turn on my profile lines. The next thing I'm going to do is go down to my layers tab, click on details, and then color by layer. And then if I go back up to my styles tab, I can change the line type to by material. And now, as you can see, it's going to translate my layers to my actual lines. Really what we're trying to do is split up different objects in our model that we want to have different line weights once we get to Illustrator. So for example, I'm making a new layer here called stairs because I noticed that there's a lot of lines super close together because of this angle on the stairs. So I'm going to add this 3D geometry to its own layer so that once I get into Illustrator, I have the flexibility to change those line weights without having to deal with all the other lines. So now this model is pretty much ready to go over to Illustrator. So we'll go ahead and do File, Export, 2D Graphic. And then because we want a vector drawing, we want the actual lines, we'll switch the file type to PDF. And then if we go to options, we can choose the size of the export. You want to get this as close to the final drawing size that you want. Now we're going to do two more exports. These aren't going to be vector, they're going to be JPEGs, but we'll overlay them in Illustrator. So the first one we're going to do is going to be just the shadows. So for this, we're going to, just like we did on the last drawing, we're going to hide the section cut and the section lines by turning them white. And then we're going to turn on our shadows. And in our shadows tab, we can make them a little bit darker. And then we'll file, export, 2D graphic, call it shadows, and then select a PNG or a JPEG. And for this, we just want to make sure it's pretty high quality so that when we overlay it, it's not pixelated. The next export I'm going to do is an ambient occlusion rendering of the model. This is essentially just a clay rendering that's going to give us soft shadows on all the surfaces, which gives us a lot more depth. There's multiple ways you can do this. I think the most general way is to use V-Ray. For this video, I'm using a plugin for SketchUp called Ambient Occlusion X. You can download it in the 3D warehouse. But this is going to give me the soft shadows of my model very quickly. And just like how we exported the shadows, this is also going to be a rasterized image that we overlay on our lines in Illustrator. I'm actually going to change the resolution of this render to the same resolution that I exported for my shadows. This is just going to make sure that the quality is the exact same and everything lines up nicely. Now the next step is going to be exporting the inverse section, which is going to give me the top half of my building. This is just the roof, pretty much. So just like I did the previous piece, first I'm going to hide the furniture because we don't need that. But I'm going to export this as a 2D graphic. And this will kind of be the last step for making our drawing. And of course, we're going to use the same settings as we did for the bottom piece. Now we can go ahead and go into Illustrator, and we're going to open up the first export that we did, which is the bottom half of our building. And once this is exported in, the first thing that I'm going to do is organize the layers and put all the different lines on those layers. So as you can see, I'm breaking it up into the different layers, such as furniture, railing, stairs, and then just kind of a base layer, which is the red lines. So in order to get the lines on their specific layers, I'll go through, and because they're different colors, you can select each individual color and then do select, same, and then same stroke color. And that's going to give you all the green lines, all the red lines, all the yellow lines, etc. And then you can move them to their designated layer. We'll do the same thing for the actual section poche, but instead of selecting by line color, we'll do by fill color, because the section poche is actually black. And then we'll separate the section cut lines, which are a little bit thicker. And then sometimes you'll find some leftover lines like these black lines. So I'm just moving them onto the base layer. Finally, you can see that every line is on its own layer now. So now we have easy control over changing the line weights. Now that everything is on its own layer, we can go ahead and select all and change the line color to black. The only reason why we needed it to be colored was to separate it. So now we don't need it anymore. Before we start adjusting our line weights, I usually like to give myself some sort of a guide. So this is what I have here, just a series of line weights that I found to work pretty well together. And I'll literally just copy this into my file, make a new layer, and just call it reference layer. And I'll use this as a catalog, I guess, of the line weights that I want to use. So now you'll see me go through and literally select the lines in my drawing, and then use the eyedropper tool to grab those line weights. And this is just kind of like getting a jump start to it. Once you start developing the drawing, then you start to see little tweaks that you want to make to the line types and the opacities. Obviously, what we want to be the lightest is the furniture. Then we want the section cut to be a little bit thicker. And then somewhere in between those two is the general line, which kind of makes up all the walls and floor plates. Here I'm going to start just cleaning up the model really quick. There's a few lines that came in from the SketchUp model that don't actually exist. So real quickly, I'm just going to go through, select, and delete those because they're not necessary. And really, this is where a very clean model, a very clean 3D model comes in handy. The worse your model is in whatever 3D software you're using, the more work you're going to have to do to clean it up. One of the most important parts of this drawing is going to be the section cut itself. So we want to make sure that we give this a really clean line weight and nice fill pattern. So before we do that, we want to clean it up a little bit because there's some lines that came in from SketchUp that we don't need. This is just like deleting the other lines, but instead we're deleting the actual poche patterns. And in some places like here, we're actually filling it where it was a little bit off. The goal here is just to kind of get everything to connect without having like little tiny crevices that aren't necessary. So once you get it cleaned up, you'll notice that the way SketchUp imports it, it's all broken up into little pieces, and we don't want that. So what we'll do is we'll select everything, go to our Pathfinder tool, and unify it. So now it's all one piece, or it's connected wherever it could be connected. This is going to allow us to add a pattern or a fill to it much easier. Here I'm taking the black hatch that came from SketchUp and making it white. This is going to act as a backdrop to the actual pattern that we put on it, so that all the lines that are behind it don't come through, because the hatch pattern itself is transparent. Over to my library here, and I have a pattern that I like, so I'm going to copy it and paste it onto my reference layer in my working file. Now I'm going to copy the section cut and paste it in place, and then use my eyedropper tool to select the hatch pattern. So as you can see, that's going to put the hatch pattern into my section cut with that white backdrop behind it. Really, there are a ton of ways to do the section cut itself, like the hatch. But for me, this has been by far like the most efficient way to do it without having to draw too many lines manually. Now I'm going to add the glass cut line. So wherever the glass is being cut, it needs to have a thicker line on the top. So as you can see, I made a new layer for this specifically, and I'm just going to come in and draw a little bit of a thicker line than the actual section cut lines. This by no means needs to be extremely accurate, so just do it very loosely, be as close as possible without spending too much time. Now that we're showing the actual glass, we need to add some sort of opacity to it to make the things that are behind it a little bit lighter. So what I'll do is just add a new layer and call it glass opacity, and then I'll just really quickly trace over where the actual glass would be. And for this drawing, because I'm doing like a very simple black and white drawing, I'm just going to make my glass a very light white color. But this is where you could add like, a very light tint of blue or whatever color works best with your color scheme. While I'm drawing it, I like to see exactly what I'm doing. So I made it red just so it stands out and doesn't hide. But now I can go ahead and make it white. And then you can see I have to kind of rearrange my layers. The glass needs to be in front of the actual model lines. And now I can change the opacity, so you can start to feel that glazing. You'll notice that I've been flipping on and off my furniture layer. This is because it's not always necessary to have it on. And because there are so many little lines, it kind of bogs down the file. So whenever I'm actually working, I like to shut it off. To add a little bit more detail to the glass, I'm going to add a little edge pattern, I guess you could call it. It's just like 3 little diagonal lines. And I'll give this its own layer just to keep it separate. And really all I'm going to do is paste this in and kind of randomly arrange it on all of my glass, just to kind of give whoever's looking at this, a very clear sense that this is a transparent material. The next thing I'm going to do is add a hatch pattern to the exterior walls. So I have these 2 patterns that I like. One's I'm going to use for concrete and one to resemble wood. These are both these are both default patterns in Illustrator. To do this, I'm going to manually select or outline the areas that I want to fill in with the hatch. I'm doing this because my model is fairly simple, so it doesn't take too many clicks to get the outline. But if you had a more complex model, I definitely recommend looking into the Live Paint Bucket tool, which is going to allow you to fill in areas of your model automatically. Now that I have the hatch patterns on, I really want to lighten them up because I think at 100% opacity, they're just a little bit too strong and overwhelming for all my other lines. Now we can add a profile line, so I'll make a new layer called profile line, and this is just going to be a thick outline that goes all the way around the model, so it really starts to jump off the page. I think a good rule of thumb to have is your profile line is almost always going to be the thickest line in your drawing. This is because you want it to be the most prominent, and whatever you're outlining, you want to stand out the most. For this drawing, I mean, it's obviously super simple, but I want to highlight all the primary architecture, that primary form of my building. And then there's kind of those secondary elements like the structural columns that kind of poke out the bottom, and then that exterior staircase that leads people up to the front entrance. Those I also want to highlight, but I'm gonna, as you can see, give them a little bit of a thinner line because we don't want them to stand out as much as that primary form that I have. So now you're kind of starting to get a feel for how much care is put into the line weights for a drawing like this in order to like put it up there at that like next level of quality. Now that I have my line weights set, I can start adding some entourage. So I'm going to use this set of people, which are vector drawings, and you can get these, you can download them online, or if there's a very specific person or set of people that you want, you can actually manually trace like an actual photo of someone in Illustrator. It doesn't take too long. After my people are set, I'm going to make 2 more layers, one for grass and one for vegetation. This is going to be for, you know, giving my project a little bit more context, I guess, at least immediate context. So for my grass, I'm just going to use this sprinkle texture from Illustrator, and I'm going to draw kind of curved shapes using the curve pen tool in Illustrator. For this specific drawing, there's no rhyme or reason where or why I'm putting this texture where I am, but this might be a good spot for you to import a site plan or actually accurately mapping where your vegetation is on your site. Next, we can add some vegetation. I'm using some vector trees and vector plants. Even though the vegetation and entourage is kind of secondary to the architecture, at the end of the day, adding this stuff to your drawings is gonna like really make or break them. This is gonna give your drawing life, and it's gonna give it scale. So the more thought that's put into it, I think the better the drawing is gonna be, rather than just kind of slapping it on there at the end. So you may have noticed that I put a couple trees that actually should be hidden behind my building. So to do this, I'm just going to mask out the parts I don't want to see by drawing a shape, and then selecting both the shape and the tree, and then going to Pathfinder and selecting the minus front option. And that's just going to hide whatever is in front of that or whatever that shape is drawn over. And I'll do the same for the other one. And this is really cool because it's not actually deleting it, so you can always go back and get that information if you need it. Now we're ready to add in our shadows. So I'll make a new layer called shadow, and then I'll open up that JPEG that we exported from SketchUp, and I'll copy it and paste it onto this layer. And as you can see, it's oversized, but it's okay. We can just scale it down to the same size as our viewport. And because it's the same aspect ratio, everything is going to line up fine. Now we can adjust the opacity to the way we want it. And I'm going to go ahead and add a filter to it, a blur, just to kind of soften up the edges a little bit. Here I don't actually have it selected, so I need to actually select the image and then I can apply the blur. The next layer I'm going to add is an ambient occlusion layer, and now I'm going to open up that rendering that I did. And just like the shadows, it's going to be the same aspect ratio, so I can just manually scale the corners down to the size of my viewport. Obviously, it's too dark right now, so for me, I'm just going to lower the opacity. But you could also take it into Photoshop and really play around with the saturation to get it the way you want. And as you can see, that really added a lot to this drawing without too much effort at all. So now that the bottom portion of the drawing is finished, we can work on the top part, which is that second export that I did from SketchUp, the inverse of the section. And really, we can just follow a very simplified version of the steps we just did for the other part of the drawing. This is just breaking up the lines onto different layers, making all of the lines the same color, black, and then cleaning up the lines, and finally adding a profile to them. And just like I did for my other glass, it's a really small detail, but I'm going to add that little etch mark on this to just show that that glass is continued up and to make it like very clear. Next, I'll add the hatch to the exterior walls and roof. Just like the bottom portion, I'll use that concrete pattern and then that wood texture. And I'll also manually select where I want this to be shown. So here I'm adding the same wood texture, but I made it separate because I want to change the angle of it for the roof. So if I click on that shape and right click and choose transform, I can go to rotate, and if I deselect transform objects, it'll only rotate the pattern. And you can kind of play around with it to get the right angle that you want. But as you can see, I kind of gave it that perspective, or the correct perspective. And then just like I did on the bottom half of the drawing, I'm going to change the opacity of the textures to a little bit lighter. The last thing I'm going to do to this drawing before I bring it over to the main file is add a white fill to the back of it, because whenever I paste this in, I want it to cover everything that it's on top of, because this is the very top layer of the drawing. Now in my main file, I'm just going to make a layer that is eventually going to be the group layer for the top piece. And then if I select everything here and then do paste remembers layers and then paste, I have to rename the layers because I can't have duplicate layer names in my main file. So now I can copy it and paste in place, and now you can see it's put exactly on top of my bottom piece. And now I can grab those layers, click and drag them into that top piece layer. So now everything is grouped. Now I can move up the top piece to where I want. And then once I have that, I can edit my artboards, which is essentially just cropping my drawing to the way that I want it to look. The next thing I'm going to do is add some dashed lines that connect the top piece to the bottom piece. And And this is a time where if you wanted to add text or some sort of action, like arrows or whatever annotating you want to do, this is probably the best time to do it. So the last thing I want to do before I export is crop my shadow and ambient occlusion images so that they fit on the artboard. The reason I do this is because whenever you export this as a PNG, it'll actually pick up that excess space on those images, and it'll kind of make your drawing a funky aspect ratio. So now that we've completed the drawing, we can go ahead and export it. Depending on how you're going to be presenting it, you can choose a PDF, PNG, JPEG, whatever you prefer. I usually like to do a super high quality PNG or JPEG. So here's the final drawing. I really hope this gave you a better understanding of how to use Illustrator and the importance of understanding the difference between a vector drawing and a rasterized drawing. And also just being able to produce an axonometric floor plan drawing like this. Thanks for watching.